Welcome to everyone online who joins us right now. Welcome to everyone who will see this later on. And yeah, I'm very honored to welcome our speakers here, Bushra, Mezna, and Sophia. This is part of the ICOP at SOAS. ICOP is a think tank at SOAS, University of London. We are doing a series of lectures on the politics of occupation in Palestine in reaction to the brutal invasion of Gaza. And we want to go beyond the mere news cycle that is very reactive to what is happening right now and reflect a bit on how did we come here basically, and to look at all the different dimensions, because it's not merely a military conflict, it's so much more. And this is what we talk about today. We talk about social infrastructure, how basically there are different policies in place that put Palestinian social infrastructure under pressure and make Palestinian life very hard. Let me start with a quick motivation. The motivation for us was at the university was observing how one educational institution, one university after the other and library got destroyed in Gaza due to the invasion, due to the war. And when you look deeper into it, you quickly notice that there are much more dimensions. It's not just education, it's not just universities that are affected by the war. It's also, I think, have seen a lot of these things in the news. It's the blocking of humanitarian aid. It's the switching off of water and energy supply. And it goes even beyond this. Hospitals are affected. Just a few days ago, there was another emergency plea from hospitals in Gaza. Places of worship are affected. Churches and mosques are damaged. And of course, cultural sites, monuments all over the place take damage in this war. And although all these things seem very different, we can understand them as social infrastructure. It's kind of a dry term, but it means that this is basically the foundation of social life, the foundation of Palestinian life, education, health, humanitarian aid, energy, all these things. And this is the motivation, is to see that these are really critical and crucial institutions that are affected in this war. And as I said, it's not just the invasion of Gaza. It goes beyond this. The conflict or the war didn't start just with the invasion in October. This is a problem for over decades, and a very special or very particular. Oh, my video vanished. A very particular issue phenomenon is that Palestinians in what is sometimes called historic Palestine live under their social infrastructure is affected in different ways depending on where they are geographically located. So we have Gaza, which is at the very moment actively destroyed. Then we have the West Bank, which is under a decades-long military occupation. And then we have Israel, where Palestinians face what some call structural discrimination. And this discrimination, the occupation, the destruction affects social infrastructure in all these areas, but affect Palestinians and their possibility to live autonomously. There's basically different regimes in Gaza, the West Bank, and Israel. And to reflect a bit on this is what we talk about today, to think about how under these different regimes, Palestinian social infrastructure is under pressure through different kinds of policies, different regimes. So let me introduce finally our speakers. Bushra Khalidi is a policy lead for Oxfam in the Palestinian territories. She is at the moment in Ramallah in the West Bank. Dr. Mezna is teaching history at Cambridge here in the UK and is at the moment preparing a book on education, the history of education for Palestinians, education of Palestinians. And Dr. Sophia Robbins, who is an associate professor for anthropology at Bard College in New York State in the USA. And she published a book on physical infrastructure in Palestine. And yeah, before we start, let me say that we have been unfortunate to not have a scholar from Gaza itself. This is due to many organizational issues. It has been quite difficult to set this discussion up how it is. I'm very happy that we managed to have these three fantastic speakers, and I'm sure that this discussion will leave even more things open for discussion. And in a later event, we hope to also have a speaker from Gaza, a Gazan scholar, and to illuminate also more dimensions of social infrastructure. Good. Finally, enough of me. We start with Bushra, who will tell us a bit about the humanitarian situation. Thank you, Bushra.
Thank you for having me. And I mean, good evening or good morning for those of us, I mean, in different time zones. And thanks to SOAS students and Dabo for organizing this and for inviting me. At first, I wasn't sure how I would contribute to the discussion, just because you know, I mean, we don't want the humanitarian infrastructure in Palestine to become a permanent one. We hope that one day we won't need a humanitarian infrastructure in Palestine, and that, you know, we'll have independent kind of institutions and infrastructures that can kind of, you know, flourish and grow on their own in a hopefully future Palestinian state. So I just wanted to put that out there because it was difficult for me to find an angle to speak on, because there are so many problematics on the humanitarian humanitarian infrastructure in the OPT, and I won't talk too much about those kind of concerns and issues. I can conclude with that, but maybe I'll give kind of an overview of, you know, how are we operating in Gaza, and then kind of like shift to the West Bank, and also while I'm explaining that, like, you know, maybe give you concrete examples of what it actually is like to work as a humanitarian worker in the occupied Palestinian territories, and how does the, you know, Israeli military occupation impede our work on a daily basis, really, and even more so since the 7th of October. And also I want to just caveat is, you know, a big requirement in the kind of development and humanitarian file in the last 10 years, I'll say, is the localization agenda. And what that means is there's been a big narrative trying push in, inside organizations like Oxfam and other big charities and humanitarian organization that we want to localize. And what that means is we want to be working, we don't want internationals to, come and set up shop in the places that we serve. We want the communities to be serving their own respective communities. So I mean, at least at Oxfam, we're mostly local staff. There's very little international staff. And so there's a big kind of requirement from donors that, we work with local communities and local staff. And it's something that I very much, love about at least working for Oxfam, that we're all Palestinian working in the OPT office. And so that's also something that has caused issues, because now in Gaza, our staff and our colleagues, but also our friends, not only are they being required to deliver humanitarian aid through insane circumstances, but they're also having to find shelter. They're having to find food. They're having to find water for their own families. And so how do you talk about localization when, your own staff is that basically their lives are at risk? And all of us here, not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, we are all affected. There's not a Palestinian that is not affected by the occupation, regardless of different privilege or different kind of economic class and background they come from. Every single Palestinian is affected by the Israeli military occupation, regardless of the privileges that they have. So it's very important also to keep that in mind. I think what's happening in Gaza now in terms of, so, the humanitarian infrastructure in Palestine has been here since the 50s. Oxfam has been operating in Palestine since the 50s. So have the major big organizations. So we've been here for decades, and we really, I really have to say that we know the context. We're not coming in and being shipped from abroad into this context. We are experts at what we do here. We know how, and especially in the occupied Palestinian territory, it's a very complex context to be operating in. It's not your usual humanitarian response because of the restrictions that you kind of mentioned, Thabo, in your introduction. And I'll go a little more into that and what that looks like on a day-to-day. But in Gaza, since Israel's military onslaught in October, basically destroying virtually every aspect of life in Gaza, from the education sector to the health sector to the cultural sector, to the humanitarian sector. Our, warehouses, our convoys, our staff, our shelters have all been targeted systematically over the course of the last 8 months. It's a record number of humanitarian workers that were killed in the last 8 months in any context in history. And 200, now we're at 275, I think. And so that has an immense impact on how we operate and how we are able to operate. And so not only are we having to operate under relentless bombardment, but we're also constrained with all of these access restrictions. And I'll talk about access restrictions a little more on the West Bank, because in fact, the policies of blockade and restriction of access and movement in Gaza that we're seeing, and that the whole world is kind of like taking a taste of, this is a reality for Palestinians everywhere before 7th of October. This is just at another scale. And what we're seeing in Gaza is we see very similar policies actually in the West Bank and Jerusalem. So the attacks on healthcare, the attacks on education, the dual use materials. This is something that we also have here in Ramallah. This is in the West Bank where I am. So there is a systematic policy of restricting aid and access for humanitarian workers in Gaza pre 7th of October, post 7th of October by Israeli authorities. So let's make that very, very clear. It's a reality that we work with. We work around with it. We as humanitarian workers, abide by principles of neutrality, impartiality, humanity, etc., which means that we also, deal with all the authorities. So we do coordinate with the Israelis on our access. For example, we need to access a specific community that is communicated to the Israeli authorities. The same thing in Gaza. delivering under relentless bombardment is a challenge in its own. But our staff have been adamant that they cannot sit there and do nothing. There have been multiple conversations internally as whether do we even operate? Do we even have an impact in Gaza? And that has been, there's been a very clear response from our staff in Gaza is that we will do whatever we can at whatever capacity we can, whenever we can. And so we have, continued our operations in Gaza, even though they don't represent the ambitions or the aspirations that we have. We have a huge, usually program in resilience building and livelihoods in agriculture. We work with farmers and farmers unions in Gaza and community-based kind of organizations. And that is just kind of gone like this since 7th of October. There are no more agricultural crops that we're able to support. There are no more a big part of our programming is WASH, for example, water and wastewater sanitation, where we work with the local authorities on, pipeline repairs and desalination units and solar panels and providing, different infrastructure for water and sanitation. That is completely all gone. There is no water and sanitation sector in Gaza since the 7th of October. In fact, today I just got a report back from our operations lead in Gaza, who says that because of the multiple displacement where people are now crammed in the middle area and in the Mawasi area and in Deir el-Balah, there's a huge problem of solid waste. It was already a problem, but now it's that there's so many people that there's no solid waste management whatsoever. And so, that exacerbates everything because all of the kind of foundations that we had built have all disappeared. There's no more underground infrastructure. There's no water infrastructure. There's no agricultural infrastructure. And there's nothing to kind of hold anything up at the moment in Gaza because it has been absolutely decimated by Israeli bombardments. And it means that we have almost reverted back to an old way of operating, which is distributing food parcels and water, which is not what Oxfam has been doing for years in Gaza. We work with communities to build communities and provide them, like, for example, with a little money. So I'll give you an example of what we could have been doing before 7th of October. We would give grants to little small young farmers. And one specific farmer was a beehiving kind of farmer. And she was like a young girl taking over the bee farm from her father and was making honey and actually exporting honey to the West Bank. And she was 23 years old and we gave her this grant to grow her farm. And I mean, these are the type of interventions that we support at Oxfam. Same thing with strawberries and cherry tomatoes. And we do a lot of advocacy with different authorities to be able to get those farmers to export out of Gaza. That has all disappeared. That does not exist anymore. Now we are on the very basic, trying to enter food and water. And even that is, completely restricted because of the closures of all of the land crossings by Israel, because of the use of dual use materials. These are materials that Israel alleges are used for military purposes and therefore are not allowed to enter into Gaza. And the problem is that for Oxfam, for example, a big part of our programming is water and sanitation, and most of the materials to build water and sanitation kind of systems are on the dual use list. So most of the things that we actually want to do and could do, we can't because of Israel's dual use and rejection of items. Another issue is the fuel. I mean, how can you deliver and drive a truck from the north to the south or from anywhere without fuel? We don't have fuel allocations. Only 20% of the minimum fuel requirements are entering Gaza, and it's only 20% at the moment. And that is really, it's for the UN and the World Food Program. So NGOs and local partners actually don't get an allocation. So we have to either buy it or we have to, negotiate it, and we don't have a priority on it. And another issue is, of course, like Israel has been able to create this kind of bureaucracy around the humanitarian infrastructure in Gaza. So whereby we have, for example, latrines that are waiting, and latrines is portable toilets for those that don't understand the technical term for it. We have about 100 of them waiting at Kerem Shalom. And it's actually not because they're dual use, and it's not actually because Israel's rejected them. It's because Israel will only allow, there's only a certain amount of trucks that are able to go in because there's limited operational hours. And so food and water are prioritized over portable toilets. So our portable toilets have just been waiting there at the border for months. And this is because of this kind of bureaucracy that, you know, has formed, that already existed before 7th of October, but now it's just the layers are unbelievable. And also because there's so many new actors wanting to come, you know, and operate in Gaza. And that's creating just an enormous kind of web of layers and different, you know, communications, coordinations, and different kind of infrastructures that have created these unnecessary delays, but all kind of stemming from the Israeli blockade on Gaza. And so, of course, as humanitarians, it's almost like we have been weaponized. I mean, if you are reading the news and you're following this, it has become a humanitarian crisis problem. It's no longer become a political problem that Israel actually is militarily occupying the occupied Palestinian territory. It's now a humanitarian crisis. We have been rendered to a humanitarian crisis. And our message as humanitarians is no. We can support a political solution, but we are not, we cannot be replacing a humanitarian solution. And this is what we're seeing. So for example, cosmetic changes like the airdrops or like the floating pier, these are things that humanitarian country team has raised concerns about. Of course, we welcome any aid into Gaza right now because we're on the brink of famine and we've got children dying of starvation. But at the same time, we don't need airdrops because there's 7 crossings into Gaza, and before we were getting about 500 to 1,000 trucks every day. Why can that happen again? You know, so again, there's this weaponization of humanitarian aid that's happening, and using kind of humanitarian aid as this mirage, you know, in Gaza, but when really these are just cosmetic changes that Israel has basically, and, you know, allies of Israel have used in order for their own political agendas and to hide, you know, away from complicity and from third state obligations. Actually, member states have clear obligations under international law. When it comes to, for example, the ICJ order, they have clear obligations to put pressure on Israel, and there's measures, and there's a plethora of measures that these member states could be taking to pressure Israel to ensure that humanitarian aid enters Gaza and to end basically this war and reach a ceasefire. But those obligations are not being met by member states and allies. And instead, humanitarian aid is being weaponized, and shouldn't be. We are only a support to a final political solution. And that has been really the message that we've been honing home as humanitarians. I'll try to finish quickly. Just in terms of like everyday issues as humanitarians, there's something called the permit system. For those of you that don't know, you know, we are governed as Palestinians by the permit system. It's because the Israeli government controls the population registry of Palestinians and therefore controls all of the movement of Palestinians. Wherever they want to go, they need a permit. If they want to get healthcare inside Israel, they need a permit. If they need to travel into Israel or to Gaza, this is pre-7th of October, they need a permit. If they are accompanying their old sick mom to the hospital in Jerusalem, they need a permit. And you need virtually a permit for everything. Some actually communities that we serve have their lands on the other side of the wall. They actually need a permit to access their lands around the wall. And these are communities that we support. So we are completely governed by this system of permits, and our staff here in the West Bank and also in Gaza had permits to be able to travel between the West Bank and Gaza, and you renew these on a very, you know, whatever various timeline basis. That has gone. So all of our staff here in the West Bank, they used to have permits to be able to travel freely all around, don't have permits anymore. So for example, I could have gone to Gaza and supported the humanitarian response, but I'm not allowed because there's no more permits. And the permit regime, of course, you know, also affects the movement of our partners and the people that we work with. We rely on this permit regime to be able to, visit our communities, travel around the West Bank freely in a short amount of time. Now we have to take very long roads and go around the wall and around settlements to be able to reach specific communities, for example, that we serve. I know that we have somebody here on the panel that is an expert on education, so I'm not going to speak on that, but I think another big part of our of programming for the humanitarian sector is supporting education in Palestine. Just to be clear, there's no education happening in Gaza at all. There are no schools operating in Gaza. There are no universities even. I mean, the universities have been completely bombed. And here in the West Bank, schools have been completely disrupted because the Palestinian Authority is unable to pay teachers. And the reason why I can't pay teachers is because the Israelis will not give the Palestinians their tax revenue that they're entitled to. And so Palestinian Authority is unable to pay its staff. And so now school is remote 3 days a week in Palestine since the 7th of October. So kids are not having a proper access to education. Not just that, kids have to cross checkpoints to go to school here. There are 57 schools at risk of demolition in the West Bank. There's been already 2 schools demolished in the last year. And here in the West Bank, there's been an unprecedented record number of settler attacks, of demolitions, of forced displacement. And nobody really is talking about what is happening in the West Bank. And we will never see kind of an escalation in the way that we're seeing it in Gaza in the West Bank. So there'll never be kind of hostilities, but we are at a breaking point here in the West Bank, and the levels of violence and the levels of kind of protection risks that we're noticing are unprecedented since the UN has started recording. And this, of course, has a direct impact on our work because, for example, we've had already 2 demolitions of water infrastructure and solar panels that we supported communities in building. This is the 2nd time they get demolished by the Israeli army, and that happened post 7th of October. And so, we are always in a dilemma saying, okay, well, do we rebuild? Are we just going to keep asking for money to rebuild so that then it gets demolished? And there's this fatigue from humanitarian workers, but also donors, who don't have any more trust because they're saying, why should we, fund this when we know that it's going to be demolished? But our message to the world and to donors is, first of all, we'll continue rebuilding. And second of all, it's your responsibility. You are an ally of Israel. So either you put the real measures and pressures and whatever measures you can take against the Israeli government to abide by its international law obligation as the main occupier here, and it has obligations to protect civilians, Israel, or you just pay for the rebuilding of these schools and the rebuilding of this, these infrastructures that Palestinians are dependent on and need. I'll finish quickly so that I can give space to my colleagues to also speak. I mean, the systemic pressures on all of aspects of life, both in the West Bank and Gaza, from education to health to movement and to livelihoods in the Palestinian territory, just creates this pervasive environment where it's marginalized and fragmented Palestinian communities. And so, of course, as humanitarian workers, this adds complete challenges and insurmountable challenges as to how do we respond? What is the right way for us to respond? We don't want to be distributing water and food to Palestinian communities who have been growing their lands for years. So we need to find ways to work with communities. And I think this is a great part of the localization agenda, is that me as a Palestinian, I inherently understand that actually the communities that I serve can grow their land. And I don't need to give them food parcels. I can support them in other ways. And this is how we have very creative programming in Palestine. And I'm very proud of that, that you will not see in other contexts, because we've had to work around these challenges of occupation. But unfortunately, it has created this marginalization and fragmentation of Palestinian communities. And you know, these pressures, through though they differ in their specific manifestation, they lead to actually similar outcomes of economic hardship, social fragmentation, cultural suppression, and of course, you know, we try to address these systemic issues, but at the end of the day, and this is again the message of the entire humanitarian community, is yes, sure, we should support Palestinians and we should protect them, and you know, in line with international law, but above all, member states and those people that we target have to address the root causes, and those are the military occupation from since, you know, for 70 years, and the illegal blockade on Gaza. And I'll stop there, and thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Bushra. That was very illuminating, especially the part that I think doesn't come across in the media when you just see bombs flying is the violence of the bureaucracy, and how the permit system, the closing, and so on, all this like bureaucratic almost harassment is creating another level of, or is also a way of violence. And yeah, I have so many more questions, and I believe our viewers also have a lot of questions. So please, at the end, we will have 15 minutes or so at least to talk and have a Q&A. So anyone who has questions, please put it in the chat. And let's move on to Mezna, who can tell us about the situation, the state of education. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thabo, for having me, and thank you, Bushra, for that brilliant sort of analysis of the question of humanitarianism in Palestine writ large, really. And so I guess I come in really as sort of bringing in the question of education to that broader analysis, and folding it in more than anything else. And I suppose what I'd also like to do is provide a little bit of a historical overview of education as an infrastructure and a way of life in Palestine. Infrastructurally, let's say, the 20th century and the history of education in the 20th century for Palestinians has been both as promise and as poison. As promise, Palestinians have been key instigators for their own mass movements for literacy and education since the early 20th century. In fact, prior to the mandate, the British mandate over Palestine. And this demand for education, and in particular mass education and public education, has been a key demand for Palestinians across the last 100 years. It is not something that has been imposed from elsewhere. In fact, by and large, education was regarded by colonial and occupying powers as a threat, that education offered a kind of social mobility and self-empowerment, let's say, that resulted in more headaches than the colonial authorities were particularly keen on taking up. The director of education, for example, Humphrey Bowman, under the mandate, was particularly keen that no one gets beyond basic literacy in Palestine. And in fact, it was villagers themselves who organized schools in the rural towns and townships under the mandate. It was not the mandate system. There were some key high schools or secondary schools and one or two colleges that had some minimal support from the British mandate authorities, but by and large, the infrastructure for education in Palestine was built by the Palestinians themselves. A lot of these institutions, in fact, cross the threshold of the Nakba and become key engines of social life and the social fabric afterwards. This is particularly the case, of course, in the West Bank and Gaza. Palestinian schooling for Palestinians who become now citizens of the State of Israel, lose all access to Palestinian schooling, and are subjugated to a regime of Israelization after 1948, which requires the curricular and memorial erasure of their Palestinian and Arab identity, by and large. For Palestinians after the Nakba who end up as refugees or displaced and dispossessed in the West Bank and Gaza, so about 80% of the Palestinians in Gaza are in that category. In the West Bank, it was about 40 to 50%, depending on the numbers. You were subjected to a kind of dualist educational system wherein some of us became Palestinian refugees with official refugee documents, and therefore were under the care of the newly established United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA. UNRWA had its own schooling system in five fields of operation after 1948. The West Bank, Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. I say I'm describing all of this infrastructurally really to describe to you the degree to which the cataclysm of 1948 utterly fractured the educational and pedagogical project of the Palestinian people that had been emerging since the early 20th century, one of mass education, mass literacy, social mobility, etc. This fracturing has meant multiple curriculums, each with their own tensions and subjugations, none of which are determined by the Palestinians themselves. There is no educational system that is completely autonomous and led by Palestinians as without any outside pressures and as a kind of sovereign curriculum. For Palestinians in Israel, as we said, there's a process of complete erasure. For Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, there is intense donor pressure. This speaks to this question of humanitarianism and the dubious role humanitarianism plays in determining curricular structure, but also, for example, for Palestinians in the West Bank, for the first 20 years after the Nakba, they were under Jordanian rule. And under Jordanian rule, the Jordanian educational project was to subject Palestinians in the West Bank to a system of becoming Jordanians and becoming subjects to a Hashemite crown. This then is replaced, by and large, with a curriculum that is censored by the occupying authorities and is a kind of colonial curriculum that aims to depoliticize and defang education as a site of of pedagogical power. I will talk in a second about how what kind, the degree of failure that project was, but that was how it was infrastructurally sort of confined and restructured under occupation. The same likewise in Gaza. The distinction of Gaza's educational system after 1948 is that part of it was certainly administered by the Egyptians who administered the West Gaza between 48 and 67, with some periods of attempts at Israeli occupation. But the educational system in Gaza at the time was, a sort of hodgepodge of different kinds of pedagogical approaches coming from all sorts of directions. There was quite a lot of instability in the system as a result, because the Egyptians sort of had this like hot, cold approach to their control over the Strip. For Palestinians outside of territorial Palestine or historic Palestine, particularly in the three fields of operation outside Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, all of those Palestinians who were declared Palestinian refugees, by and large, some were not, some were nationalized, especially in Lebanon and in Jordan. They were in UNRWA refugee schools. UNRWA refugee schools were in 1949, in agreement with these host states, required to take on the curriculum of that host state. So not in no period after 1948 did Palestinians write their own curriculum, by and large. They were experiencing different kinds, managed kinds of curriculums produced by others. There was one phase during the 1948 war itself, about 8 months before the formalized establishment of the UNRWA curriculum, or UNRWA system, where school teachers were regathering in the initial camps of displacement and dispossession, and gathering kids around them and teaching them. That is the first, and until the genocide, the only experiment in decolonized or decolonial education for Palestinians. You see some of this reemerging now in Gaza, in fact, where teachers are gathering young people in these new encampments and trying to educate these young people despite the infrastructural destruction and decimation of the formalized educational system. And there's a kind of, this is to say that there's a tradition, an unfortunate tradition of Palestinians seeking alternative pedagogical spaces despite and against colonial impositions and violence. Another powerful example, obviously, of this is during the First Intifada between 87 and 93, when Palestinian schools were, by and large, completely unstable and shut down in long periods of curfew, or during general strikes, when teachers and educators were gathering people under trees, across alleys, across windows, and trying to build different kinds of pedagogical experiments and projects for young people in their communities, in their camps, in their neighborhoods, etc., in their villages. So I set up this kind of fragmented, almost kaleidoscopic educational system in order to help us think about what it would even look like to demand a rebuilding or advocate for the right to Palestinian education. What kind of education? Where? For who? How? What is an educational system supposed to do anyway, let alone seek to rebuild it? So much of what we think about in the modern period when we talk about education is so bound up with state building and state formation. What does it mean to talk about education under statelessness? What is that education for? The answer in Palestine by international organizations, including UNRWA, for the last 75 years has been education for employment. And this is what I mean about the dichotomy, as it were, a very simplistic one, I'll admit, but one that is helpful, at least for me, for thinking through this, is that education for labor, education for employment, has produced a particular kind of pedagogical narrowness or corridor for education writ large in Palestine. It has, there's the element, the promise of it is obviously the promise of social mobility, that given people's loss of land, their loss of illiquid assets, as it were, as a result of the Nakba, education could be now their new capital, social or otherwise, by which they can rebuild themselves, they can rebuild their communities, their families, their society. But the hammer, the poison in that promise is that this education for employment would steer you further and further away from freedom. that it is meant to give you the sort of a poison chalice of an education that is always going to be bound up with subjugation. And that subjugation, as I said, can come in multiple forms. It can come from curricular impositions, both by donors and by host states. It can come with censorship. It comes from an inability to experiment in the classroom, a kind of very straight-laced, narrow vision of what education can be. It can be, it can be unbound or destroyed through a slow process of defunding, as Israel has done with the withholding of taxation, and then through processes that are familiar through, in all kinds of modern states, including the US, which is education that has been neoliberalized, that has been gutted of its radical potential and progressive potential. And that is also a way, Palestine is of the world. So the problems, the infrastructural problems that education is facing everywhere in the world, it is reflected back and refracted back in Palestine but understanding that it does so under a kind of other layers of subjugation and colonial rule. And this, the teachers' strike was, let's remember, the Palestinian teachers first in the West Bank and Gaza under those educators under the Palestinian Authority schools, began their strike in 2015. And when they did so, it was the largest single sector strike in Palestinian history. 50,000 teachers were out on the streets. This is an extraordinary union effort, and it was actually a wildcat strike. So a central part of the educational infrastructure in Palestine has been how bound up it is with processes of unionization and union efforts, and trade unions being key vectors and key interlocutors with education. Education as employment and educational labor necessitated that in all sorts of ways, in particular when we were, in the 1960s and 70s, when unions regrew their strength under a revitalized national movement. So I want to go back to this question of what does it mean to think about infrastructure and education and a rebuilding of it. What we have now in Gaza, and it is one that has resulted in a kind of furor by Gaza scholars and educators and teachers themselves, and one that I think is really important for us to take leadership from and pay attention to, is the concern they have that the discourses in politics and of solidarity around the genocide, including, descriptions of the ways education has been disrupted or destroyed in schools. And we're talking about, hundreds of schools destroyed now, tens of thousands of young people killed or injured, nearly 700,000 students no longer in school, universities bombed or destroyed or damaged beyond repair, requiring complete rebuilds, etc., has tended to make the case that the educational infrastructure in Gaza has completely collapsed. And what these educators are saying is that's not entirely the case, that an educational system is its people. And so long as there are people there who are willing and able to be leadership in a revitalized educational system, then it is from them that we should take leadership. So they have issued a letter. Gaza academics have issued a letter saying, in these, due to this fear that the infrastructure that will be built or that will be developed for Gaza's educational system will largely reproduce the kinds of subjugations manifold, multifold, even worse. And that they want to nip that in the bud now by demanding that it is Palestinians in Gaza who should decide how this new educational system or infrastructure should be developed and built. They know best. They have the expertise. In fact, some of the brightest and most talented education scholars are in Gaza and from Gaza. And it provides them with an opportunity to build an infrastructure, potentially liberatory infrastructure, that can be reproduced in other parts of Palestine, that can place pressure on a kind of sclerotic, corrupt, horrible system in the West Bank, for example. So I offer here then this kind of broad sense that when we're thinking about education and we're thinking about what education means for Palestinian society, and what this current phase of destruction and annihilation and elimination has done to education, I think the key note is that there has been a slow attempt at eliminating the capacity for Palestinians to develop a self-determined education that is over 75 years old. That story needs to end despite a genocide, and it starts that end. You begin a new phase with a demand that the Palestinians and Gaza themselves rebuild the infrastructure of their educational system, just as we must take their lead on how Gaza in general must be rebuilt. And I know that they can do it better than anyone else can, and that sure as hell includes the United States and anyone else who wants to intervene. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mezna. That was it was extremely illuminating to see the role also of international institutions like UNRWA, and how those are also, I mean, from an economic perspective, you could also almost look at the economic kind of imperialism, where the institutions are built to serve basically the economy, which is integrated into world economy, which is quite unequal, and serve basically international markets much rather than developing the tools for emancipation for Palestinians. And that's very interesting. That's very, very illuminating. That's what I mean. Okay. So, Sophia, please. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so thanks again, everyone, for watching us, and Thabo for organizing this. It's an honor to be on this panel. I'll be talking about the state of Gaza's physical infrastructures and also policies that have been hindering Palestinians' infrastructures across the territories that Israel controls. The first thing to say is that I want to emphasize there are shared logics and outcomes across the territories Israel controls, even if we see different tactics, intensities, scales, and rates. So I'm really echoing my co-panelists here in making this point. The three shared logics I want to focus on here are the lack of control over land, destruction, and the production of dependence. So as we look at the state of Gaza's physical infrastructures, we see that not one single type of physical infrastructure has escaped destruction by Israeli violence in Gaza. In March 2024, the EU, the World Bank, and the UN published a report capturing the first 4 months worth of damages. They estimated $18.5 billion in damages from the destruction of 60 to 70% of all infrastructures in Gaza. A lot of the numbers I'm sharing today are from that report, which means that they're highly out of date. You have to imagine much higher numbers for everything I'll quote to you. Also in January, the UN Conference on Trade and Development estimated it would take roughly 70 years to restore the 2022 GDP levels in Gaza, which themselves were not signs of a good, healthy economic arrangement. So focusing on a couple of physical infrastructures, we see massive destruction of roads, 62% of all roads, 92% of primary roads, of course, vehicles and the impacts on mobility, access to relief aid, access to services, and of course, family reunification are quite severe. At the same time, we should notice that Israel has been building roads itself. So in March, it completed construction of a road bisecting the northern part of Gaza east to west. It's called now the Netzarim Corridor, which is named after a settlement that was removed in 2005. And this road has also been given its own highway number already, 749. In order for this road to be built, destruction had to take place according to the Israeli security mindset on both sides. So we saw universities, homes, etc., destroyed. Observation towers were installed, which also makes it a highly militarized road. And two more roads, Israel constructed two more roads, one granting access to Khan Yunis in southern Gaza, and another granting access to Rafah. So these roads are, of course, exerting increased Israeli control over the territory. The road that bisects Gaza is also now a barrier that prevents return into the north. And of course, these roads assert a long-term presence in Gaza. In terms of electricity, the situation was dire way before October 7th, but as of October 7th, the 10 power lines that were leading into Gaza from Israel were shut down. The one Gaza power plant ran out of fuel on October 11th. And there is essentially, as you already heard, no electricity being delivered to the Gaza grid. There had been and has been a system of solar panels, especially on rooftops, but many of those are also destroyed with bombings of those buildings. This is a visual of one solar infrastructure that was destroyed in the fall. As you heard, again, in terms of water and wastewater infrastructures, many of the, I mean, actually at this point, all of them have been damaged or destroyed. And just the small detail, as we heard from Bushra's presentation, of the lack of things like toilets and showers. So there was in April 1 shower per 3,600 people in Rafah as of April, and 1 toilet per 850 people as those portable toilets waited outside. Another visual of accumulated sewage, just to get a sense of how people are living. I also really recommend visualizing Palestine for infographics that really help connect a lot of the things you see in the media. So what does it mean to have 1 toilet per 850 people? Here you see the case for this being understood as a part of creating genocidal conditions. Solid waste, as we heard, most of the facilities have been damaged or destroyed, including medical waste facilities, administrative buildings, maintenance workshops, storage rooms, containers, and vehicles. The fuel shortages and, of course, dangers to staff are similar to the ones that are experienced by humanitarian organizations like what we heard about. With the concentration of people down in the south, you have people in temporary shelters living amidst heaps of waste, which is, of course, a massive risk for disease, infection, and, of course, environmental pollution. This is a visual from the Financial Times, giving you a sense of where some of the dump sites have been concentrated. Shelter is the physical infrastructure maybe we've seen most in the media in terms of its destruction. Well over 70% of the housing stock has been damaged or destroyed. And of course, temporary shelters are now also being damaged and destroyed, including UNRWA schools and even tent areas. So we had the tent massacre in on the 27th of May. And shelters like humanitarian aid organizations are being weaponized. People are exposed to the elements. We don't even have the chance to talk about things like the lack of privacy, which become extremely important to people because we're talking about just the ability to survive physically. But at the same time, as with the roads, we should pay attention to construction plans that are floating around. So American and European donors are already having discussions to think about how to rebuild Gaza as a commercial hub. So precisely not including Palestinians in that equation. We have Israeli settlement real estate developers making plans for and advertising real estate for settlements in Gaza. We have real estate events taking place here in the United States, advertising Palestinian land parcels for Jews. And then, I have here Jared Kushner's quote that Gaza's waterfront property would be very valuable all the way back in February. So a visual that's very familiar to a lot of us. Food infrastructures, as you heard already, have been largely destroyed or damaged. Bakeries, food shops, farmland has been bombed, also contaminated. We don't even have the chance to talk about the long-term impacts of some of this in terms of the environment and the ability of people to sustain themselves. Olive groves are destroyed or couldn't be harvested in the fall. And of course, access is unsafe. All of this leads to food price inflation and most people being dependent on aid. And that's how you get to the famine and the less well discussed in the media inability to heal from injuries, which a lot of doctors talk about as being tied to nutrition. This is a visual from a bakery. So to move quickly into how this connects to policies that have been hindering Palestinians' infrastructures across the territories that Israel controls, I just want to emphasize again that since 1948 and actually since the British Mandate period, but just to begin with the Nakba as we typically talk about it, we have similar logics and outcomes even when we have different tactics, intensities, scales, and rates. So I'll talk again now briefly about the three logics. One is the lack of control over land. So you can't have infrastructure without control over land. So here I have a list just of some sample tactics that Israel has been using over the last many decades to prevent Palestinians from controlling land. Again, different tactics, different names, different kind of enduringnesses, but all leading to a lack of control over land. The second logic to emphasize is, of course, destruction, which is what we're seeing most obviously in Gaza. But I want to emphasize that takes place across all of the lands that Israel controls through home demolitions, bombings, cycles of bombings, but also quieter techniques like the prevention of maintenance and rehabilitation of the infrastructures that support Palestinian life and communities, as well as pollution of farmland and grazing areas. And then the third logic to highlight is dependence, which we've already heard about quite a bit. The tactics include conditional foreign donor fund dependence. So any infrastructure that Palestinians want to build must go through foreign donor funds that are also always conditional. So for water and sanitation, solid waste, electricity, roads, you name it. And then, of course, here, this is an example of the World Bank taking credit for some waste infrastructures in the West Bank. And meanwhile, Palestinians are also heavily reliant on Israeli infrastructure services and companies, which is why Israel can cut electricity when it wants to or water when it wants to. So this is my final slide, just to emphasize the outcomes that are shared across the territory. And here I've placed a visual from Visualizing Palestine. We have inequality between Jewish, Israelis, and Palestinian communities, but also among different Palestinian communities. Of course, we have expulsion as what we're seeing most rapidly taking place and most intensely in Gaza, but that's been taking place slowly over many, many decades. The compression of the most Palestinians onto the smallest pieces of land, social erasure as people are forced to move and communities fragment. Impoverishment in Palestinian majority areas, which fuels racialization and dehumanization, as Palestinians are associated with areas that are not well serviced. We have land being made available to Jewish Israelis as Jewish Israelis replace Palestinians across the territories, and the massive waste of time, energy, and resources of Palestinians, of course, as they try to navigate. Even when it's creative and optimistic, there's still an incredible drain on resources that could be put elsewhere. And the final thing I want to say, which really echoes what my co-panelists have said, is that across the territories Israel controls, Palestinians have not been able to determine which infrastructures and services they even want to have supporting their lives. And therefore, the kind of vision for a just polity that they may have has not so far been able to be encoded into the infrastructures of everyday life in Palestine. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Sophia. That was a very helpful structural view about like the experience that we saw Bushra talking about and Mezna, and seeing on what scale across these things happen. To conclude, I would like to ask you in 1 minute to share a experience or with in your field of mutual aid, emancipation or resistance of Palestinians against these structures. Mezna, you in your presentation, you already alluded to it, and it would be really interesting to maybe Bushra with the humanitarian situation, mutual aid experiences, or Sophia. I guess that's almost more difficult with physical infrastructure, but I would be really interested to hear what is happening, how Palestinians are basically resisting this system through mutual aid and so on.
I can start because I have to go.
Yes, thank you.
I'm just the first thought I had, because I've worked on waste infrastructures in particular in the West Bank, was that people, one of the ways that dependence is generated is, like I said, through the forcible dependence on international donors for construction of physical infrastructures. But it's really important to remember that infrastructures come in all shapes and sizes, and the donors usually select particular kinds of infrastructures to fund because it works for their way of thinking about how they, efficiency or scale. And usually with wastewater infrastructures, they fund large-scale wastewater treatment plants, which come up against the Israeli bureaucracy right away, because any large-scale water infrastructure is controlled by many layers of Israeli bureaucracy. So many communities end up living with their own sewage and polluting, kind of inadvertently polluting the lands because they can't get infrastructures built. So I guess I will say that I had the opportunity to see in the Bethlehem governorate really incredible work on very, very small scale wastewater treatment plants, for example, that could be built at the level of a school or even a home. That could bypass precisely the permit system because of their scale, and also the need for large-scale funding. So I do think that, that is not a long-term kind of solution to major physical infrastructure needs that involve supporting especially dense urban areas. But I do think that there's a lot of small-scale work that's done that can work around essentially the kind of combination of Israeli bureaucratic impositions, and also the Palestinian Authority's kind of obsession with large-scale infrastructures that will perform statehood or state readiness somehow. So that's kind of hopeful, but certainly still not a long-term solution.
Thank you, Sophia.
I actually did not. Can you repeat the question, because my connection is a little choppy, so I couldn't hear your question, Thabo. Can you just?
Sure. Sure. It was just like sharing one experience of mutual aid among Palestinians that is able to resist this systematic, that this system of oppression of Palestinian or Palestinian communities.
I'm going to speak more on kind of the global solidarity movement that we've been seeing. So I think, you know, a lot of people in the sector, you know, ask us, well, why OPT over Sudan, over Haiti, over the Congo, you know, and, you know, there's no worse or better, you know, we should all be supportive of all of these movements. We should be in solidarity with Sudan and the Congo. Everything is linked at the end of the day, in so many ways. But what I want to say is that Palestinians have been actually doing advocacy and campaigning work for the last 70 years. And actually we've been, I think, like, we have laid such strong foundations. I don't think that you could go to any capital, even before 7th of October, and not go, there wouldn't be a week that goes by, I think, in any capital across the world where you wouldn't have something about Palestine organized somewhere. And we've been doing that work as Palestinians. We have been doing that work for decades. And I think that the fruits of that labor, even though it feels like there's no impact on the ground and that things are not changing in Gaza, for example, or in the West Bank, and if anything, every day is worse. For me, the global outrage and the global solidarity movement from all aspects, not just the protest, but really virtually every single sector, I think gives hope to kind of change. There has been a change and we need to acknowledge that. And I want to also, you know, give support to the student movements has really shifted the dial in a way that we have never, ever seen before on Palestine. And I want to encourage, you know, people in those academic spaces and students to continue, you know, with their demands and to continue standing in solidarity with Palestine. And also making those links with the Congo and with Sudan and with Haiti, because, you know, really, unless the occupation doesn't end in Palestine, and unless international law is not actually applied in Palestine, it will not be applied anywhere else. And so Palestine really sets a precedent for all of these global, you know, different movements, and especially in the application of international law and the international rules-based order that, you know, we thought we had aspired to and that we need to protect and make sure that is, you know, upheld in the utmost respect. So I'll say that in terms of like a hopeful note, you know, to conclude. Thanks.
I believe this note of international solidarity is a perfect one to end on. Thank you very much, everyone. Yeah, we need to keep unfortunately, in a way, we need to keep the conversation going. And yeah, thanks everyone for watching and for keeping the word out and for, as Bushra said, like, keep organizing. Thanks a lot.